Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. As you can probably guess from the title, this video is a sequel to another video I made last year, but I want to make it clear you don't need to watch that video to understand this one. I still think you should watch it if you enjoy this one. It contains a lot of my favorite weird statuses from my original notes and also lays down some ground rules, but it's not needed. I do, however, want to make a couple corrections regarding things that have changed since that video's release. Jump ahead to this timestamp if you don't care. The first correction I want to issue is regarding the Frozen status effect, which is now just part of the Cold status. Once enemies reach 10 Cold stacks, they're frozen for 3 seconds before breaking out with 3 Cold procs left. All abilities that used to apply Frozen, like Thermal Sunder, Freeze, and Avalanche, now just apply Cold at 10 stacks. Frost, Snow Globe, and Ice Wave can now also freeze because they apply Cold procs. The bizarre wake-up threshold Freeze had is entirely gone now too, though the lack of any breakout animation or effect is still present. It also has an updated visual effect, which I really don't like that much, honestly. The other status effect I need to correct is Petrify, though this is a much more minor thing. Because the old health class system was removed in favor of a per-faction damage system, Petrify now increases the faction boost of all damage types by 50%. Fortunately, this still affects damage types that aren't normally strong against a given faction, including Void and True damage. This is mechanically very similar to how it used to work, but it's still an important distinction. Okay, with all that out of the way, I want to establish up front that this video isn't going to be nearly as focused as the last one. Like I said, I saved a lot of my favorites for the first video, so this one is going to cover a lot of topics that are more fringe, I guess? I don't know, you'll see what I mean in a bit. To start though, I want to cover a very broad but very interesting topic I never got around to in the first video: damage vulnerability. Damage vulnerability is a very broad category, with lots of different things inflicting it and several inconsistencies between its sources. Wow, we're in the first paragraph of the first section and this is already a problem. Glad to see nothing's changed. As you might expect, enemies under the effect of an ability that inflicts damage vulnerability will take more damage, but it's surprisingly more complicated under the hood. You see, Warframe has 3 different categories for enemy health: HP, shields, and overguard, with armor functioning as a special category that provides damage reduction to HP only. The inconsistencies start when you ask a pretty simple question: which of these health categories are made vulnerable to damage? Interestingly enough, it's not consistent, because God forbid this game ever be simple. So, from my testing, the most limited source of damage vulnerability in the game is Nova's Molecular Prime, which only affects health, not shields or overguard. This damage vulnerability is a flat doubling of damage though, regardless of strength or other factors, which means that both slow and speed Nova can apply it. Next up are Rage and Petrify, which can't even be cast on enemies with overguard, but do grant more damage towards health and shields. Neja's Blazing Chakram does this too, but it doesn't boost overguard damage despite not being outright blocked by it. For abilities that do affect overguard, Caliban's Sentient Wrath, Sevagoth's Reap, Ureli's Sea Snares, and Jade's Judgements all grant bonus damage against overguard as well as health and shields. Some sources of damage vulnerability will only affect specific damage types, namely Magus Accelerant and Destruct, which affect heat and puncture damage respectively. These only boost their respective damage types, but this also works against overguard alongside shields and health. Something important to note is that these sources of damage vulnerability multiply with each other, meaning you can get very large bonuses by stacking 2 or more of them. The only exceptions to this are Rage and Petrify, which are additive. Shout out to Nova Umbral for telling me this, by the way. He had absolutely no idea I was working on this video at the time and just so happened to bring it up. So that's pretty much it for damage vulnerability more broadly, but I want to focus on one source of it in particular: Jade's Judgment. Judgments are a unique status effect that can be applied in 2 ways: by having an enemy contact the radius of Jade's Light's Judgment ability, or when hit by her Glory Exalted weapon at a 10% chance. Judgments make enemies take 50% more damage to health, shields, and overguard for 10 seconds, and both of these values cannot be changed by mods. What makes Judgments special is that, aside from not being affected by mods, they also have unique interactions with the rest of Jade's kit. For starters, enemies who die while under the effect of a judgment will grant 2 seconds of extra duration to Jade's second ability, Symphony of Mercy, up to double its duration. More importantly though is its interaction with Glory, where Jade can spend 25 energy to detonate all enemies marked with a judgment. These detonations can be done once per second, regardless of mods like fire rate, reload speed, or casting speed, and they also aren't affected by a lot of mod types. Most notably, both base damage and multi-shot do not benefit the alt-fire explosion, so if you're building around it, those can be swapped out for things like critical chance on damage, status chance, faction damage, and elemental mods. The last thing I want to note is that this explosion deals damage in a 4-meter radius at base, but this radius is increased by 50% if the enemy is standing in the radius of a light's judgment. I know a lot of this is kinda just Jade 101, but I think it's a cool concept to have the Judgment status effect serve a dual purpose. A damage boost anyone can take advantage of, and a detonation that only Jade can utilize. This, of course, can easily make her nuke frame number 37, but hey, it's cool in concept at least. Next up is one that is admittedly kind of a misnomer, at least in its common usage, but I can't really think of any other way to put it. This is damage reduction, but I don't mean in the sense of reducing the damage you or enemies take, but instead reducing the damage that enemies can actually output. The first and most common example of this is the puncture status effect, which reduces enemy damage by 40% on its first stack, going up to 80% reduction at 5 stacks. Each individual puncture status also adds a flat 5% more critical chance, up to 25% at the max of 5 stacks. Well, 5 is normally the maximum number of stacks, but Jade's bow Evensong can actually bypass this. Evensong releases an AoE when fully charged that inflicts 7 puncture procs, meaning that enemies hit by it deal no damage, while also having a 35% higher chance to be critted when shot by the player. I honestly find this to be a really neat way to implement this kind of mechanic, and while it isn't exactly amazing in terms of its usefulness, it is still really cool. The other main way to reduce enemy damage output is through Nightform Equinox's Pacify ability, but it has several problems, to put it lightly. So, how Pacify works is that it creates an aura around Equinox that reduces enemy damage by 50%, going up to 90% at max. Hey, editing cool kid here. So, the 90% damage reduction cap is actually wrong. I got it confused with the 80% cap on the augment, but beyond that, Pacify is in much worse shape than I first realized. You see, the more strength you have, the more the damage is reduced, but it seems to have diminishing returns. You absolutely can reach 90% damage reduction, it just takes 500% power strength, which is insane. As far as I've seen, the ability actually has no cap, it just gets so absurd in its strength requirements that reaching those higher numbers isn't realistic. You could theoretically reduce enemy damage by 95% or more, if you get over 1000% power strength, which outside of relic buffs or having a Nidus teammate is basically impossible. All of my math moving forward will use 90% as its maximum number, because I spent like 2 or 3 hours on those segments and I really don't want to remake them, but know that it's more realistic to be closer to 80% damage reduction or so, which makes this already bad ability even worse. Alright, back to the original script and Pacify's other problems in 3, 2, 1. That sounds pretty alright, but we get into the first problem. It drains half an energy per second for each enemy in the effect radius, and this isn't reduced by duration mods, though efficiency fortunately still works. This doesn't stop energy regeneration from things like Wellspring, Pizzas, or Energy Vampire, but it does put more strain on Equinox the more enemies she's weakening. It also doesn't count for channeling base Incarnate perks or arcanes, which I think is just kinda funny. Even more bizarre, though, is that this ability has fall-off as you move away from Equinox. Basically, the radius of the ring is split up into 4 sections, with each section being marked at 1/4 the radius of the ring starting at Equinox herself. So, the farther away you get from Equinox, the less the damage gets reduced. It's 100% of the listed effect if an enemy is within the first quarter, 83% in the second quarter, 67% in the third quarter, and 50% in the last quarter. This is really bad. This means that 90% damage reduction falls off to only 45% at the farthest edge, which is a huge loss in survivability. To put this into perspective, damage reduction can be expressed as what we call an effective health multiplier, or EHP multiplier. So, for example, if you have 100 health and an enemy attack deals 10 damage, it takes 10 hits to kill you. Alright, simple enough. Now if you have 50% damage reduction, that attack will only deal 5 damage, so it takes 20 hits to kill you. This means you effectively have 200 health, because it takes the same number of hits to kill you at 100 health with 50% DR as it does if you were at 200 health with no DR. Or, in other words, 50% damage reduction is effectively a 2 times health multiplier. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. I hope. So then, 90% DR makes that previous 10 damage attack deal 1 damage, meaning it takes 100 of those attacks to kill you. This means that 90% DR has an effective health multiplier of 10 times, as it would also take 100 attacks to kill you if you had 1000 health. You might see where I'm going with this. If an enemy is in the first ring closest to Equinox, they deal 90% less damage to her, which grants her a 10 times effective health multiplier. but if they're in the furthest ring from her, they'll have their damage reduced by 45%, which is a less than 2 times effective health multiplier. This ability doesn't get linearly worse as it falls off like the equation implies, it gets exponentially worse because of how DR is handled. Something even funnier about this ability though is its capacity for trolling. You remember how I said the damage reduction amount is affected by power strength? Well, using a combination of overextended and growing power, you can make this ability go from reducing enemy damage to increasing it by a multiplier of 5 times. I find it equally hilarious and appalling that this is even possible in the first place, but it honestly just goes to show how much Equinox has been forgotten by DE, especially when it comes to her Night form. I have one last thing written down in my notes which I'll read verbatim here, and please pardon my language. Why the actual fuck is the fall off a mechanic? Can this frame not catch a break? Yeah, I think that puts it pretty neatly. Okay, now we're on to the weird stuff. Discharge, don't you dare fucking laugh, is a unique status effect only accessed through Volt's ability of the same name. It's somewhat similar to Electric, but has some key differences that make it noteworthy. So, to break the ability down, when cast, enemies will be affected by the Discharge status if they are hit by the initial wave, or if they enter the ability's radius within 4 seconds. Enemies under the effect of Discharge will be rooted in place and deal 600 damage in an 8-meter radius twice per second, with the range and damage being affected by range and strength mods respectively. Now, what's interesting about this is that enemies will only deal damage to other nearby enemies at first, not taking any damage from themselves. However, if a discharged enemy isn't in range of any other enemies for 4.5 seconds, this changes and they'll begin to damage themselves instead. This 4.5 second time limit isn't affected by mods, so if your discharge duration is less than it, enemies won't ever start damaging themselves, which is especially noteworthy because the base duration of discharge is only 6 seconds. On to some other things to note. Discharge is non-refreshable, meaning it can't affect an enemy already under the effect until the effect is ended, and it also can't be cast again during its initial 4-second effect window. Discharge also has damage falloff, starting at 100% damage closest to Volt and falling off linearly to 50% at the very edge of its radius. Discharge is also affected by the bonus damage from Volt's static passive, but in a way that isn't at all intuitive. I'll show the formula on screen now. Basically, the damage of static is divided by the damage per tick and then multiplied by half a second. The most noteworthy part of this interaction is that it only affects the first enemy hit by Discharge, with all other enemies receiving normal damage. Alright, one more thing. Whenever Volt Shock hits an enemy affected by Discharge, it'll explode in a burst of damage, which is pretty cool. Oh, actually, I should also probably mention that Discharge doesn't actually inflict an electric status on enemies, meaning purple shards don't work with it out of the box. I don't know why it works like that. Moving on to another starter who is most certainly well-loved and definitely not maligned by a nearly decade-old meme, we've got Mag and her Magnetize ability. This ability is both really cool and really weird. Wow, great video title, cool kid. So this might be kinda hard to explain. To get the basics out of the way, whenever magnetizes a target, a bubble appears on said target for 15 seconds with a radius of 4 meters, affected by both duration and range respectively. Shots fired into Magnetize are pulled towards its center, which can make landing shots on specific body parts difficult. Fortunately, if you line up your shot correctly, it is still doable. This bubble holds the target enemy in place, unless they have Overguard, and increases all damage that enemy takes by 2 times, though this multiplier only applies to health damage, not shields or Overguard. This bubble also has a unique trait called Magnetic Force, which pulls nearby enemies in. This starts at 4 times and increases with power strength, as does the 2 times damage multiplier mentioned earlier. Okay, so that's the basics, but now we get into the peculiar stuff. The Magnetize bubble will absorb damage as long as it's active, dealing 25% of all damage from absorbed weapon shots and polarized shards. This damage is dealt every half second, though it has falloff the further the enemy is from the bubble's center. Critical hits and status effects aren't taken into account for this damage over time effect, though multi-shot is. Projectile weapons like Stephalos or Nataruk will also have their projectiles suspended in the center of the bubble until they expire. Now, when the bubble's duration does expire, it can actually do 2 different things depending on if the initial target died or not. If the target did not die, then it will dissipate with no further effect. However, if the initial target did die, then the bubble will explode, dealing 300 blast damage in a 15-meter radius. This explosion has falloff and, unlike most AoE attacks, is actually limited by line of sight, but that's not the weirdest part. You see, whenever an enemy inside the bubble takes a tick of damage, the current tick damage of the bubble is added to the explosion damage. So, if the bubble is dealing 100 damage per tick, and it hits an enemy 10 times over the course of 5 seconds, it will add 1000 damage to its explosion. As far as I'm aware, this doesn't scale with the enemy count, so much as just the damage of the bubble and if it's actively hitting at least one enemy, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Another weird property of Magnetize is that, if the corpse of the target despawns, the enemy pull effect is disabled entirely, though the bubble will still explode. As for a few other interesting notes, enemies targeted by Magnetize also take 1500 additional damage from Crush, and only 3 bubbles can be active at a time. If a 4th one is cast, then the oldest existing bubble will either dissipate or explode, depending on if the initial target died. The last thing I want to note is that players can be magnetized, specifically by Malice, but it has a few differences. Namely, it doesn't pull in allies or lock the target in place, and it can be shaken off with a roll. So, astute viewers may have noticed during the damage vulnerability section that I skipped a pretty important ability, Banshee's Sonar. I did this because it's pretty tricky under the hood, so I wanted to give it its own section. So, when Banshee casts Sonar, a glowing weak spot appears on the enemy, and damaging this weak spot increases the damage they take by the ability's damage multiplier, which starts at 5 times and scales with strength. And we already have our first problem. You see, the big glowing weak spot actually isn't the part of the enemy that gets weakened specifically, because why would that work that way? How it actually works is that the weak spot marks a given body part, and that whole body part takes the increased damage, even if the weak spot isn't covering it. On humanoid enemies, this is divided into 6 pieces: head, torso, left and right arm, and left and right leg. On non-humanoid enemies, it varies quite a bit, so we're just gonna gloss over that. Something rather annoying about this is that sonar points can bleed over across multiple body parts, so being able to tell which one is actually taking more damage can be challenging. The damage multiplier from sonar can also stack with body part multipliers, such as headshots, but more importantly, sonar procs can overlap with each other. On humanoid enemies, this caps at 2 overlaps, which causes your sonars to multiply with each other. So, for example, if you have the base 5 times damage multiplier and you get another sonar proc on the same body part, they'll multiply together to 25 times more damage. If you have 200% strength and get a 10 times multiplier, they'll multiply into 100 times damage increase, and this isn't even considering things like headshots. The reason I said it caps on humanoid enemies is because on non-humanoid enemies, it is a bit wonky. I first want to credit the Warframe wiki user Aminissi for their findings, and applaud them for being seemingly the first commenter in the wiki's whole history whose parents aren't siblings. So basically, many humanoid enemies, like the Murmur and Infested, can stack up to 3 or even 4 times, giving you ludicrous damage numbers. Enemies that are smaller or more simple though, like Rollers, can only get 1 stack of Sonar, though those are relatively easy to kill anyways. Something I also want to note about Sonar is that it only increases the damage of the initial hit, not any damage over time effects that hit inflicts, except multi-target DOTs. For those who don't know, gas and electric can hit multiple enemies, which means they can actually target body parts unlike single-target DOTs, those being Heat Slash and Toxin. Many Warframe abilities also actually target the torso, so if an enemy has a sonar mark on their torso, many abilities will actually deal increased damage. Most notable of these is Banshee's own Soundquake, which actually becomes usable if you have a ton of power strength and an overlapping torso spot. Okay, last thing. Helios' Detect Vulnerability and Duviri's Neural Pulse appear to work the same way as Sonar, but as far as I can tell, these abilities can only trigger on an enemy once, so they can't stack with themselves. Our next status, Inferno, is exclusive to Ember's own Inferno ability. If you thought this ability just dealt a heat proc, I regret to inform you that, while it does do that, we have to make it more complicated. So, in addition to that heat proc, Ember also inflicts this unique Inferno effect, which is a cloak of fire that lasts for 15 seconds and grows to a size of 5 meters, dealing anywhere from 350 to 700 base damage per second based on the immolation meter. All of these stats are affected by the mods you'd expect: duration, range, and strength. Interestingly enough, enemies can spread this effect by touching other enemies who are unaffected, and they'll take damage from both their own fire and the fire of nearby enemies. Multiple casts of Inferno do not increase the damage of the Inferno effect though, and if both enemies that touch have Inferno already, they won't do anything to each other. Now, I would like to comment that this ability's damage is pretty damn low, even with full immolation. Armor stripping with Fire Blast helps, but it's not enough to carry it a lot of the time. If you really want to put in some work with the status effect, you'll need some way to group enemies up, like Cordon on Nautilus. I don't think this is legal. This method means enemies will be taking damage from upwards of 20 Infernos at once, which helps a ton. Magus Accelerant can also work for boosting Inferno's damage, as it deals, well, heat, so that's useful too. Last thing I want to note is that Inferno gains a secondary effect when the mod Exothermic is used, which causes enemies to have a 15% chance to drop an energy orb. That doesn't sound very high, but because this ability hits everything you can see in a pretty large area, it adds up pretty quickly. We actually talked a bit about this status, Breach Surge, back in the first video, but all we did was cover its blind effect. To be fair, that is interesting, as it doesn't open enemies to finishers, but does open them to stealth damage bonuses like Radio Blind does. But Breach Surge has an additional effect that I completely ignored in the first video, Surge Sparks. Whenever you damage an enemy under the effect of Breach Surge, they have a 10% chance to emit a Surge Spark, and they're also guaranteed to emit a spark if they either die while under the effect, or each time they get hit by Wisp's Sun Laser. This chance being rolled on hit means high fire rate and high multi-shot are both very valuable for spitting out as many sparks as you can, and DOT effects from things like Slash can also emit sparks. Spark hits and spark kills do not emit more sparks though, so keep that in mind. Surge Sparks seek out enemies in a 10 meter radius and strike them for 2 times the damage of the hit that spawned them, dealing pure radiation damage. This 2 times damage multiplier can be increased with power strength as well. They have a 100% critical chance, 1.5 times critical multiplier, and a 20% status chance which only triggers radiation. These sparks can also headshot, allowing them to trigger headshot-based effects like Bombastein's Malice. Something interesting to note is that Surge Sparks themselves can also be affected by several weapon damage boosts, including Arcane Arachne, Vigorous Swap and Holster Ramp, Eclipse, and even Rift Torrent. Now, this part doesn't have anything to do with the status itself, but I want to highlight some cool synergies Breach Surge has with Wisp's kit at large. Whenever Wisp's Will-O-Wisp is out, casting Breach Surge will also emit a surge at the clone's location. Wisp can also cast Breach Surge while looking at a Mote Flower to teleport to it instantly, which also doubles the radius of Breach Surge. This doubling even works on the clone's Breach Surge if it's active when you teleport to a flower. I already mentioned the last synergy, but just to reiterate it, each time an enemy takes a damage tick of Soulgate, they'll always release a Surge Spark. Oh, one last thing. I did put on a long Syandana just so you'd keep it in your pants. Okay, this status has one of the most metal names of anything in Warframe, Crimson Curse, which is a status unique to Garuda's Seeking Talons. Whenever the Talons in question hit an enemy, they mark them with this special icon, which means they're under the effect of the curse. As long as they have this icon, any attack will have a 75% chance to inflict a slash status, which goes up to 100% chance at 134% power strength. I want to reiterate these slash procs can be triggered by almost any other source of damage, including things like Syndicate effects, Warframe abilities, mods like Acid Shells, and even the aforementioned Surge Sparks, which creates a very funny infinite feedback loop. Other DOT ticks do not trigger the effect though, as that would be hilarious, but admittedly excessive. Another noteworthy thing about Crimson Curse's slash procs is that they actually do benefit from both status damage and status duration mods placed on the weapon that triggered them. Any slash status effects that would have otherwise been inflicted by the player's weapon, such as through natural status chance, Hunter Munitions, or internal bleeding, cannot trigger on the same hit as a proc from Crimson Curse. If you've been using internal bleeding on Nagantaka but you normally play it with Garuda, this is your heads up, you can actually take that off. Continuing with the trend of hard as hell names, we have Collective Curse on Color Bow. On paper, this ability is pretty simple. On cast, it shoots out a wave of energy that chains enemies together, and those enemies share 50% of the damage they take with all other enemies enchained. This is like our 7th BDSM ability, what the fuck? That 50% damage sharing caps out at 100% once you reach 200% power strength, so enemies will share the full damage of any hit they take. Now, despite seeming simple enough, there's actually a lot going on beneath the surface, because this game needs to put food on the table of fandom employees. So, the big thing with Collective Curse is what kind of damage it spreads. Status effects themselves aren't spread, though damage from DOT ticks do get spread, so we can check that off the list. But beyond that, the type of damage CC deals is actually dependent on what it hits. If you only hit a shield, the ability deals a special shield drain damage that only damages shields. If you only damage health, it deals true damage, which will only damage linked enemies' health. This true damage ignores armor like Slash and Finishers do, but is still hampered by innate damage reduction on things like Necromechs. This true damage also goes under enemy shields, so if a shielded enemy is linked to an enemy with only health, and that health gets damaged, the shielded enemy will still take damage to their own health. Overguard damage is not passed on to other enemies at all, but despite all that, you've probably noticed you can still kill whole groups of enemies despite these factors. So why is that? Well, if the hit deals enough damage to destroy an enemy's shield or overguard, and there's still damage left over, that damage will still go to their health, which can then be spread to the health of other enemies. Because Color Bow can deal so much damage with heavy attacks from Wrathful Advance's crit chance boost, it often doesn't even really matter what kind of enemy you hit first, as you'll probably be dealing enough damage to kill everything linked 3 times over anyways. One last little utility thing about Collective Curse is that melee hits will add combo count for every single linked enemy. The damage they take is still counted as ability damage, so XP from Collective Curse kills will still go straight to Color Bow, but you can use this mechanic to rack up combo for heavy attacks very quickly. This also applies to the shot combo mechanic on sniper rifles, which, funnily enough, makes Color Bow, the heavy melee character, arguably the best sniper rifle user in the whole game. This linking doesn't add melee combo count for non-melee hit sources though, like Rauta, Recompense, or Storm Ibuko. The wiki says the last two work, but as far as I've tested, those don't add any additional combo when used with Collective Curse, though they do add combo for their knife hits regardless, which is really nice. Our next status effect goes by two names, being Doom, though apparently it's also called Phantom Wrath. I don't really know why the wiki has this listed, because the ability is called Doom, and synergy notes refer to the status effect as being doomed, but whatever. Doom is also apparently a reference to the game Hades, but that was told to me by Rose, so if it's wrong, blame her. This status effect is exclusive to Daggeth, and can be applied with either her Doom ability, or by any ability or attack when her Spectral Spirit Augment is active. Doom is interesting because it has both its own complexities by itself, and has a lot of synergy with the rest of Daggeth's abilities. So, as for the effect itself, whenever an enemy becomes doomed, a scythe will begin to hover over their head for 15 seconds. This scythe will store 35% of all damage dealt to the enemy over a 2-second window, and at the end of that window, it will deal that stored damage as true damage. The 35% damage storage amount is also affected by power strength, capping out at 100% with 286% strength. Wait, I just realized, is Phantom Wrath what it's called when the scythe actually hits the enemy? That might make sense. Important thing to note is that, if the stored damage is enough to kill the enemy, it will skip the 2-second wait period and kill them instantly. The calculation to determine if an enemy is about to die from the stored damage takes viral procs into account, but strangely enough, it doesn't consider damage boosts like Roar or Eclipse, or damage vulnerability debuffs like Sea Snares or Blazing Chakram. Also, somewhat funnily, Phantom Wrath can actually rob Daggeth of conditionals by stealing her kills, which can make activating things like Arcanes and Galvanize mods a bit tricky, though in my own experience, it's generally not too bad. So, that's how Doom works in isolation, but Daggeth's other abilities are also all augmented if they hit a doomed enemy. For her one, enemies who are doomed and get struck by a scythe will spread the doomed status to enemies in a 15-meter radius while refreshing their own doom timer. The critical damage bonus from Grave Spirit is also doubled when attacking a doomed enemy, which combined with the scythe insta-kill mechanic and the viral from the sides make Daggeth very capable of bursting enemies down. For her fourth ability, Rakali's Cavalry, enemies will have 35% of their armor and shields removed each time they are hit by the ability, so long as they're doomed. I want to take this time to mention that the horses from this ability hit multiple times, so while a 35% defense strip sounds really weak, they only need to hit an enemy twice to full strip if you're at 143% strength, which is much more doable than the 286% strength required for a one-hit strip. This ability can also be spaced to hit enemies multiple times during its startup, which, when combined with the fact that the defense strip is considered before the damage it deals, lets it deal some serious damage to tougher enemies like Acolytes. Add on to that Doom will store the damage the horses deal, and the horses deal a ton of damage, and it makes Daggeth incredibly good at killing groups of enemies if they're lined up in front of her. Just like Colorbow. Or Corvex. Or Dante. Ah, hell. Our next status effect is interesting because it doesn't actually do anything by itself, but rather enhances another effect. This status, being Hydroid's passive, doesn't have an official name, so I'm just going to call it Wet. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, but the devs didn't name it, so I'm going to have to take matters into my own hands. Wet is inflicted onto an enemy when they take any damage from Hydroid, be it from his abilities or weapons, and this effect lasts until the enemy is killed. I repeat, this effect lasts permanently and has no duration whatsoever. You can tell if an enemy is wet by looking for the smelting corrosive icon above their head. So what does Wet do? Well, just one thing. It makes the first stack of corrosive on an enemy remove 50% of their armor instead of 26%. This allows corrosion to remove all armor at 10 stacks, not just 80% like normal, and I want to make it clear that this can be done by any source of corrosive past this point. Hydroid himself doesn't have to apply the corrosive, anyone or anything else will be able to full strip with it so long as Hydroid has made the enemy wet. As a small synergy, Hydroid's Plunder will also make armor loss on corrosive procced wet enemies permanent, so even if the corrosive stacks expire, they'll still be missing their armor. Alright, short and simple, just like Rosie, let's move on. Our last status effect tied to a specific Warframe belongs to Citrine's Fractured Blast, though this one is interesting because it's not really its own autonomous status. I'm calling this Fractured for ease of communication, and it's denoted by this floating crystal above the enemy. Applied exclusively by Citrine's Fractured Blast ability, this status grants the enemy a 20% chance to drop an energy orb and a 50% chance to drop a health orb, scaling with power strength. Interesting thing is, this status doesn't have its own timer. Instead, it will remain on the enemy so long as they have an active slash proc from any source. So, if you apply a slash proc before the slash from Fractured Blast expires, the effect will linger even after the original slash proc goes away. That's, really the only interesting thing about it. This section is going to be a bit different. You see, thus far I've been covering status effects that aren't conventional status effects per se, but these status effects actually are conventional status effects. The difference is that this is Railjack, and none of the IPS or primary elements here function like their grounded counterparts. So, considering I never did them in the status tier list, I thought I'd go over them here. You don't really need to know any of these because you can normally just press Seeker Volley and go do something else, but hey, you're here to learn anyways. I do want to mention that information about these effects is limited, so this won't be able to be as thorough as I'd normally like. Alright, these are pretty simple, so we're gonna move through them pretty quick. First up is Impact, which gains the Concuss effect. Concussed enemies have their accuracy and damage reduced by an unknown amount for 6 seconds, with subsequent procs refreshing the duration. Puncture gains the Decompress effect, which reduces enemy shields and armor, again by an unknown amount, for 20 seconds. Additional procs stack additively with itself, which would be great information if I had any idea what the percentage actually was. Well, the Railjack page says it stacks additively, but the Puncture page says it stacks multiplicatively. I don't know, dude, this shit sucks. Slash gets the Tear status effect, which makes affected enemies take 7.5% more damage for 20 seconds. This effect seems to stack multiplicatively with itself, which I honestly hope is wrong, because in this case, that's not really that good. Heat gets the Sear status effect, which deals 6 ticks of damage over 5 seconds using the following formula. Basically, mods and heat damage bonuses from things like innate weapon elements boost its effectiveness. Interestingly though, Sear deals damage instantly like a multi-target DOT would, and its stacks have independent durations, both of which are not how the regular heat status effect works. Cold status effect is Immobilize, which causes enemies to be unable to move or attack for 6 seconds, locking them in place. Subsequent procs of Cold refresh this effect's duration. Electric becomes Scramble, which disables enemy weapons and controls for 6 seconds, with new procs refreshing the duration. This is very similar to Immobilize, except enemies will fly in a straight line, keeping their trajectory from the moment they were scrambled. Toxin basically becomes Radiation with its new effect Intoxicate, which causes enemies to attack and be attacked by allied vessels for 12 seconds, with new procs, again refreshing the effect's duration. The last status I want to talk about is Blackout Pulse, which may sound weird as you'd think it's just an electric proc. Blackout Pulse does trigger an electric proc, yes, but it also has its own separate stun that locks enemies in place. It basically is a combination of Scramble and Immobilize. Alright, that's it for Railjack. Sorry if it wasn't super in-depth, but I wouldn't be surprised if even the developers didn't know half of this stuff. Alright, let's move on. This final section is an interesting one, because it isn't actually about status effects at all. You see, on the last Weird Status video, a lot of people told me I should cover the Dismemberment effect, but as I thought about it, I realized that Dismemberment isn't really a status effect, because it only applies when the enemy, dies. As such, I've decided to separate status effects as things that require the enemy to still be alive, while on-death effects only apply at the time of the enemy's death. A good example of an on-death effect is Molecular Prime's explosions, which only trigger when an enemy under the effect of Molecular Prime gets killed. Many elements have special effects if an enemy is killed by a hit that would have triggered a proc of that element, though this also seems to depend on a few other factors, like if the weapon is high in that element's damage, or sometimes just being unique to weapons altogether. These effects are often purely visual, so let's run through a couple examples. Heat damage and procs cause enemies to burn up. Corrosive causes enemies to melt. Blast and impact make enemy bodies ragdoll. Electric causes the enemy to convulse after death. And cold makes enemies shatter into pieces. Many weapons, such as the Opticor family and Jade's Glory, also cause enemies to get outright atomized when killed by them. The wiki says that puncture can allegedly leave a large hole in the target, but I have yet to observe this myself, so I don't know, I'll edit this part of the script if I can find a way to trigger it. Gas also has an on-death effect, sort of. Basically, the cloud of gas doesn't go away when the enemy dies, going from being a normal status effect to a lingering on-death effect. Now we get to the initial one people were curious about, Dismemberment. This on-death effect is tied to slash damage and can be triggered in a few ways. Any kills while the Amalgam Ripka's True Steel mod is equipped, when an enemy dies from Tentacle Swarm, or most often, if more than 50% of a weapon's physical damage is made up of slash. Elements do not interfere with this calculation, and if a weapon is below 50% slash, you can use slash mods to get it over that line, which will allow it to dismember. Note that, unlike Heat, Slash's on-death effect is not triggered by an enemy dying to its status effect, as Slash's bleed status deals true damage instead of actual slash. Corpses can also be meleeed to dismember them even further, which is kinda psychotic, honestly? So what makes Dismemberment so special? Well, the reason it's noteworthy is because it has a special interaction with Necros' Desecrate ability. As you're probably already aware, Desecrate has a 54% chance to reroll the loot drop chance on enemy corpses as well as drop a health orb. Thing is, dismembered body parts like limbs are counted as separate corpses by Desecrate, meaning you can essentially turn one enemy into multiple corpses for the purposes of the ability. This is a big part of why it's common to use Ripkas on Necros, as the Amalgam True Steel mod makes it guaranteed that kills will dismember regardless of how the kill actually happens. This mod does have some finicky elements, like multi-target DOTs not consistently triggering it, bows and other pitting weapons not working, and the Cold Shatter effect bypassing it entirely, but it's still a rather reliable way to trigger the effect. Alright, that should be everything. Real quick before I let you go, Wimmy asked to be in this video, so if you've made it this far, please type "Hi Wimmy" in the comments to let him know that you appreciate his presence. Beyond that, I want to give a huge thanks to all of my channel members for supporting my channel's awful upload schedule. Like, sub, join the Discord, brush your teeth, eat lean meats, I don't know, I've never been good at the outro thing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time when I post Part 3 in 2026. How did that happen? Oh, he's tweaking. What the?